Buenos días.
Good morning, dear presidents and representatives of the Conference of Regional Legislative Assemblies of the European Union, authorities, speakers, colleagues from the media, regional MPs, parliamentary group spokespeople in the Regional Assembly of Murcia. Welcome, one and all. I would also like to especially greet viewers who are following us through the live streaming that is being broadcasted via the Regional Assembly of Murcia's website, as well as through our YouTube channel. Good morning, and thank you very much for being with us, which is only possible thanks to the opportunity provided to us by new technologies. Welcome to this session of the Calre Natural Disasters Working Groups, which I have the honor to coordinate. The reason why I wanted to lead this working group is that I preside over the regional parliament of a region that is located on the vortex with the highest seismic risk of the continent. The latter is affected by a climate that makes it one of the regions that is most prone to natural disasters of unforeseeable consequences. Its geographical location, weather peculiarities, and geological conditions give way to frequent natural disasters, namely floods and earthquakes, phenomena that historically have had devastating consequences for the region of Murcia. The alternation of periodic droughts and heavy seasonal rains are a constant in our region, given rise to dramatic events throughout history. Let me give you a few examples. The current region of Murcia suffered the so-called St. Calixtus flood on October 14, 1651, which caused over 2,000 deaths and devastated the city of Murcia in the 17th century. And then we have the unfortunately well-known St. Teresa flood in 1879, with over 1,000 dead, and it triggered an unprecedented wave of international solidarity. There was a Paris Murcia Association to help casualties, and yesterday we celebrated 47 years of that tragic 14 October, and so through the Ramba del Nogalte, which is to date the greatest flood in the Iberian Peninsula, with over 350 liters per square meter. There were 14 dead in Puerto Lumbreras, 13 Lorca, and 10 in the Almeria region, and 50 in the small town in Granada, Colorado. Even today, the cut-off loads continue to wreak havoc in our region and destroy homes and farms in their wake. The most recent of these heavy rainfalls took place in September 2019. Thank God there were no deaths, but substantial damage did happen. The estimated cost of the property that was lost in the town of Los Alcázares is 100 million euros. In addition to these disasters, the region of Murcia is impacted by other natural events of a different nature because it is located in an area with a great seismic activity in Spain. The region sits on different faults, the most active of which is the Lama de Murcia fault, which is continuously moving, and it causes most of the small quakes that occur in the Guadalintin Valley area. And it also causes earthquakes, as the one we will be discussing throughout this morning occurred on 11 May 2011, with 9 people dead and over 300 injured. And it has given way to this event called seismic disasters, the Lorca earthquake, a history of reconstruction. At the beginning of 2020, we began to prepare this work with great enthusiasm and responsibility. A goal was for Lorca to become this year the European capital for the study of seismology. To this end, we planned to hold a conference that was to take place on May 11 and through 12, coinciding with the 9th anniversary of the earthquake, and in which the catastrophe, the disaster, would be analyzed from a physical and geological point of view, with a special emphasis on its consequences and on the difficulty of the reconstruction and the different institutions involved and people impacted. We immediately contacted the mayor of Lorca, Mr. Diego Jose Mateos, who from the first moment, and I thank him for this, gave us his unconditional support and made available to us all the necessary infrastructures for this event to be successful. So much so that on March 5th, the day before to the lockdown, we held a meeting over there at the Lorca town hall to outline their project, and we even presented the latter to the media. So everything was done and ready. We would have spent 3 days when Lorca would be uh, especially the main character, so to speak, in Europe. Unfortunately, the outbreak of the pandemic, which is still ongoing, forced us to change our approach. A complicated situation that we're going through prevents us from spending these days at Lorca. And personally, I especially regret this, not only because it's a city with an outstanding artistic and cultural heritage, and I wanted to give relevance to its castle, its synagogue. By the way, the only synagogue that has not been propagated in the Spanish state. Then the old quarters of Murcia with vestiges of the past, such as Plaza España, the St. Patrick's Collegiate. We wanted to show this to Europe. We also wanted to have learned on site about the rebuilding process of a town that was destroyed by the aforementioned unexpected disaster. Faced with this situation, we've decided to make the most of new technology so the project moves forward. In this sense, I want to express my deepest gratitude to all the participants who are going to enrich undoubtedly these days with their testimonies and their knowledge. I'd like to thank Ms. Encarna Fernandez Simon, President of the Spanish Assembly of Parliamentary Lawyers and General Secretary of this Regional Assembly, who will introduce to us the role of regional parliaments in natural disaster. I would also like to thank Mr. Diego Jose Mateos, Mayor of Lorca, who will discuss how the city recovers following an earthquake like that in 11 May 2011. We have three well-known journalists, Mr. Antonio Peñarrubo, who's the head of the Murcia's regional television, Mr. Alberto Aguirre de Carter, who's the director of the La Verdad newspaper and dean of the media, and Mr. Domingo Camacho, who's regional director of Cadena Ser, the dean of broadcasting radio company in the region. They will participate in a roundtable chaired by Lucia Hernandez, a journalist with Onda Regional, and they will discuss the crucial role played by the media in the face of a natural disaster. I would also like to thank Jose Jesus Martinez, who is general manager of research, who will discuss precisely seismology, and more particularly, he will be covering the Alama fault and the consequences that the latter may have on the region of Murcia. I'd also like to thank the participation of architects who, from the start, played an important role in rebuilding the city, and now Lorca is a beautiful reality following that really sad nightmare that happened following the event in 2011. I would like to reiterate my greetings and acknowledgement to one and all for being on the other side of this screen and following our streaming, for participating in this meeting. And I would also hope that the conclusions drawn be of the liking of all, and whatever is discussed here will help in future disasters or natural catastrophes, not only as regards Murcia, but also anywhere across the old continent. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor over to Ms. Encarnación Fernández de Simón Bermejo, who has a degree law by the University of Navarra, legal advisor to the Murcia Regional Assembly since '83, and since January '97, she is legal advisor and secretary general. In September 1998, she was appointed president of the Spanish Association of Regional Parliamentary Legal Advisor. She holds this position to date, regardless of the fact that her published works, conferences, and talks are known around the globe. She actively participates in Latin American universities. They seek the guidance and orientation of Ms. Encarna Fernández de Simón. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to her to discuss the role played by regional parliaments in the face of this kind of disaster. Ms. Fernández de Simón, good morning, and thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you very much, dear President. First of all, I would like to thank the president of this working group, coordinator President Castillo and his team, and the president of Calre for trusting me to give this presentation. I hope I meet your expectations. Secondly, I would like to explain how I will cover my talk. I'd like to focus on some natural disasters and its consequences in Europe over the past years. I'll begin in 2002. Later, I'll explain why, and we'll look at some pictures to remind you of the relevance of what happened then. We'll look at Europe and more zoom in Lorca, and then explain the role played by the Murcia Regional Parliament given these natural disasters. Let's look at the heavy rains that fell in August 2002 in Central Europe, which caused an increase in the flow of the Elbe, Danube, and Lava rivers and forced evacuation of almost 250,000 people, especially in Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic, and in Dresden, Germany. They caused 103 deaths. Also, about 30,000 people were evicted from their homes in the region of Saxony, Eastern Germany, and the German army had to establish a complex device to evacuate thousands of sick and affected. The flooding of the above-mentioned rivers was spectacular to the magnitude of rainfall, as you can see here on the picture, and even the Sempra Opera House, one of the most beautiful in Europe, located in Dresden, the so-called Florence of the Elbe, but its magnificent architecture was submerged underwater. In Austria, the cities along the Danube were also flooded, and damage was estimated at 3,000 million euros. The German Chancellor back then, Mr. Schroeder, said that the material damage to infrastructure was estimated at thousands of millions of euros. It's a natural disaster, hence what we've started with this. This gave way to the European Solidarity Fund. In 2009, the world stopped spinning for 67,000 people on April 6th at 3:30 in the morning. The center of Italy cracked, and a tremor of magnitude 6.3 on Richter scale crushed literally L'Aquila, the capital of the Abruzzo region. 309 people died and 1,600 were injured. Years later, sadly, the city is still undergoing a very slow process of urban reconstruction and emotional rebuilding. Today, its inhabitants are still trying to recover that world that halted on that fateful spring night, and for many has changed for good. L'Aquila earthquake was happened had its epicenter 2 kilometers northwest of the city, and the hypocenter was at 8.8 kilometers according to, and it shook the whole center of Italy, in particular the middle and upper valley of Alterno River. By the number of victims and amount of damage, L'Aquila earthquake was the worst disaster in Italy after the 1980 Irpina earthquake, which caused many deaths. So this earthquake caused damages to 3,000 to 11,000 buildings in the medieval city of L'Aquila. Hundreds of constructions collapsed, and most inhabitants had to flee their homes, and many streets were left impassable because of the masonry that had fallen to the even the hospital where the injured were taken that uh, had been built with European funds were affected. The cathedral lost part of its crews. About 40,000 people were left homeless, and you might remember the controversy caused by the unfortunate intervention of President Berlusconi, who said that homeless earthquake victims should consider they were on a weekend camp out, and well, many of them had taken shelter in temporary accommodation. Also, the President of the Republic refused international aid. At some point, they said Italians were proud people and the country had enough resources, but in the end, he accepted all the international help that went to Abruzzo on 20 November 2009. An agreement with the European Commission for Regional Policy was signed, by which Europe contributed with 493.7 million euros. Pascal D'Angelo, poet born in the area that then migrated to New York at the entrance of Borgo Trento, and said, people from Abruzzo are different. We believe in dreams, quote unquote. Was a tribute to the renovation, the rebuilding of the city of L'Aquila that had been destroyed. This disaster caused by the earthquake seen 2 mayors, 6 prime ministers, and 3 presidents of the republic, and they have not advanced to make that tragedy but a bad rain there in this city in ruins. The Calre plenary took place in 11 May 2011, and I was part of that plenary session, and we were thrilled in L'Aquila because there was it was really interesting and really exciting because of the concert that took place here. And in 2011, there was an earthquake in Lorca. The magnitude of 5.1 was a Lamay, and it hit Lorca, but it was felt everywhere across the region. There were 11 dead, as the president mentioned, some 300 injured, 10,000 were evacuated, and many spent the night outdoors because they couldn't go back. The earthquake happened at 6:45 p.m. and the epicenter happened in this area here, and the hypocenter was 1 kilometer. That's why it was a particularly severe earthquake, because of the shallowness and the moderate magnitude. So it resulted in a great impact. Damages were estimated at 100 million euro, but we will discuss this later on. In 2016, let me remind you that the La Matrice Italian area with 96 dead, our apologies, but the sound is not reaching the booth, and I'm afraid we cannot interpret. This is the interpreter speaking. Our apologies, but the sound is gone. Okay, now it's back. The magnitude was 6, and it was kilometers deep, and the inhabitants were sleeping, and the state of emergency was declared in Italy, and many had to find shelter. Over 500 were definitely evicted, and hundreds of buildings were destroyed, and reconstruction is also something that hasn't been done. From the 26 billion allocated to the impacted area, only 1.3 have been effectively invested, and this reconstruction is slow, and it's sometimes on a halt, as the mayor of the city, Antonio Fontalena, mentioned, because of the Italian red tape. Damages were estimated, as per the reports and to the European Commission, in 24 1,852 million euros and they called for the activation of the so-called Solidarity Fund. The Commission authorized a maximum advance 30 million funds. Then we have in 2019, you might remember the damages, the St. Mark Square. Some people swam there. It was devastated. It's a World Heritage Site. And this is the consequence of heavy rainfalls and serious flooding in 2019. The one inside the basilica reached 90 centimeters high and severely damaged this wall. The renovators said that the water can be taken out, but salt remains and this complicates rebuilding. The state of emergency was declared and damage to historical buildings were severe, and at some points in the city there were 60 centimeters to 1 meter of water. This event that left over 70% of the old quarter underwater, and the damage accounted for millions of euros. And then we have in the eastern coast of Spain in 2000, because of a cut-off law, there were torrential rains of some 400 liters per square meter, and this impacted the whole Spanish Mediterranean arc in September 2019. It caused 9 fatalities and huge flood damage over the flowing rivers, flooded roads, hundreds of evacuees, unused homes and businesses, and incalculable losses of all kinds happened, including the railway. Hundreds of civil protection troops were mobilized, and the military emergency unit was deployed. The storm had a devastating effect on Murcia, Valencia, and part of Almeria, and even areas in Castilla-La Mancha. The damage was then estimated at more than 190 million for damages to homes and businesses, and some 200 million damages to farms. Many livestock holdings were impacted, some 2 billion in infrastructure damage. I will not remind you of many more disasters as a consequence of natural phenomena. The latter sufficiently illustrative, but they all have a common denominator, and that's that these 3 natural disasters set in motion the aid and solidarity mechanisms, the European Union, namely the called Solidarity Fund, which allows to provide aid to a member state or an accessory country region in the event of a major natural disaster. This was created in 2002 as a consequence of the aforementioned floods in Central Europe that we saw only a moment ago. This fund now has been it's modified to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and given the pressing need to face the latter, and this has been implemented. This fund to aid if in the face of flooding, droughts, and forest fires and so on. It has helped over 24 countries, providing over 5.5 billion euros. That can help in the case of natural disasters, severe natural disasters that have serious repercussion in the livelihood and the economy of one or more member states or regions or candidate countries. Natural disaster considered serious, severe, if it causes direct damage to the state, estimated at more than 3 billion euro. These are prices set by the EU in 2011, or which represent damage above 0.6% of the member states' GDP. And a major natural disaster is defined as any natural disaster in the region that produced direct damage of more than 1.5% of the region's GDP. In the case of outermost regions, according to Article 349 of the Treaty of the Function of the European Union, as the Canary Islands, the Azores, that I believe participate in this seminar, this threshold is set at 1% of the regional GDP. If the disaster affects a number of regions, this threshold is applied to the average GDP of those regions, weighted depending on the proportion of total damage in each region. The European Solidarity Fund comes in the form of a grant that complements the public expenditure of the beneficiary state and is to be used to finance measures to mitigate damage, which in principle are not insurable. The urgent measures eligible for funding are the following: immediate restoration of infrastructure and facilities in basic sectors such as energy, water, drinking water, wastewater disposal, telecommunications, transport, health, and education, provision of temporary accommodation relief funding to cover the needs of the affected population, immediate security, the infrastructure prevention such as dams and measures to protect cultural heritage, and cleaning of disaster, including natural areas. How does this fund work? Well, in 12 weeks of the occurrence, the damage caused by the disaster, the state that is affected or concerned needs to submit a request for a contribution to the Commission. The state has to submit an estimate of the total direct damage and its impact on population, economy, and the environment concerned, as well as the cost of the necessary measures. Should also mention other possible sources of funding and describe the application of the law, of the rules and regulations of the EU on disaster prevention related risk management with the so we're talking about regulations to prevent floods, or rules and regulations that affect buildings in keeping with seismological. On the basis of this information, any of the information is requested to state or region, the Commission will assess whether the meet conditions for assistance from the fund and will determine as soon as possible the amount of the possible financial contribution of the fund within the limits of available resources, and if the final valuation is positive, i.e. if it's considered the requirements observed of the rules and regulation, then it conveys without delay to the European Parliament, the Council, the need for joint decision and authorization. Once Parliament and Council have adopted this, the Commission will pay a single payment to the beneficiary state. So now you can have an advance of this payment, and the Commission produces a preliminary assessment, verifies it with the resources available where appropriate, and adopts this decision to provide an advance. With a caveat, the final decision of the fund, the maximum amount of the Solidarity Fund is 30 million euro. The beneficiary states responsible for managing the operations supported by the fund, and the European Commission must be able to monitor that actions that are funded are managed appropriately. The aid needs to be used. This is another limitation within 18 months starting at the date at which the aid has been disbursed, and a comprehensive report needs to be submitted. Let me make a brief reference to what I mentioned earlier about the extension of the scope of the European Fund in the European Union to cover serious public health emergency, namely in reference to the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. It can be activated by any state in the EU within 4 months of the date in which the country has taken its first action to combat the pandemic, provided that it exceeded 1.5 billion euros, or 0.3% of the nominal income, the nominal GDP. And the funding will complement the efforts of the countries concerned, will cover part of their public expenditure to provide swift assistance to those affected by a major public emergency from COVID-19, including medical care and protecting population from risks through prevention, monitoring, and control of the spread of the disease. So you've heard about COVID funds. Well, part of those funds are due to the extension of this European Solidarity Fund. After this brief presentation, that's been pretty fast, but I haven't been given too much time, I would like to make reference very briefly to the specific case of how the Solidarity Fund has worked in relation to the Lorca earthquake in 2011. Spain requested the fund activation in 2011. This happened in May. So and the Commission said that since the direct damage was estimated at some 124 to 240 million euros, the funds would be activated via as per the clause on extraordinary regional disasters. This aid was a bit slow. Under this clause, the Commission could grant aid when a region suffers an extraordinary disaster that affects the majority of population that has had serious and lasting repercussions on the living conditions, economic stability of the region. Spain claimed serious damage to public infrastructure, schools, the library, the music conservatory, historical monument roads, and so on, with an estimated cost as per the report drawn up by the Director General for the Budget and Funds of 141 million euro. Regional and local authorities demanded a rapid response to an exceptional situation. Above all, swiftness. Spain asked Mr. Durão Barroso's commission that the community process be made more flexible with a view to avoiding late aid that would not allow to really cushion effectively the disaster. It was 2011, and the regulation of the fund had not been changed. Only advances have only been accepted since 2014. And as the mayor of Alcuila mentioned, spoke about the cumbersome European bureaucracy, red tape, did not give in, and Spain submitted the application. All procedures were performed, and Spain was awarded a grant from the Solidarity Fund for an amount of 21,070,950 euros to finance urgent measures to the earthquake in Lorca. This was 12 May 2014. So the support arrived, but not immediately. And although this financial solidarity instrument was modified in 2011, it is far from being as agile as it should, because when faced with the tragedy as a consequence of such a disaster, people cannot wait and need to get back on their feet as soon as possible to go back to normal. In Murcia, though, even there's a seismic risk, as the president reminded us at the beginning, our collective memory was not very familiar with a catastrophic event of this magnitude, and this despite being one of the most active seismic areas. But this seismic activity has been mild. In 2008, the Spanish Seismic Network identified 4,205 earthquakes in the area of the Alhama fault, of which only 162 were captured by seismographs as having certain relevance. Well, this 2011 earthquake, although it did not have relevant intensity, if we compare it with earthquakes occurred in countries with high seismicity, including Japan, Chile, Mexico, or the States, was highly devastating and destructive, because since the focal depth of the hypocenter was so shallow, the consequences were devastating. It's estimated the earthquake damaged 80% of all buildings in the city. Some 1,200 homes were demolished, 55 bays were demolished too. And in this case, the effects of this event not only include the scope of damages that need to be replaced, but they're also mental and social consequences in this case. And we need to look at what national authorities and regional authorities do. And I'm almost done with my presentation. How do they mobilize funds to respond in this area? What about regional parliaments? In the case of the Lorca earthquake, the first emergency measures plan of reconstruction, which established both short and medium actions to be carried out. There were the necessary economic commitments were drawn up. The Lorca plan came about. The Spanish government approved in May and October decree laws including urgent measures to repair the damage caused by the earthquake, to compensate for damages to farms and livestock facilities, to help trade, and there were tax reductions with accounting for about 1.2 billion, and there was aid for the recovery of the heritage. And Ministry of Culture developed a master plan for the recovery of
de Murcia. El Gobierno regional también ha contribuido a la recuperación y, entre otras medidas, gestionó y obtuvo un crédito del Banco Europeo de Inversiones por importe de 185 millones de euros para la reconstrucción de espacios y reposición de equipamientos en toda la ciudad. El préstamo fue concedido en julio del año 2012, aproximadamente un poco después de que se hizo efectiva la subvención del Fondo de Solidaridad. Podría decirse, por tanto, que el dinero europeo, el dinero que nos prestó o nos subvencionó Europa, ha servido de manera indiscutible a la recuperación y reconstrucción de la ciudad. Las actuaciones del Gobierno regional en carreteras, 60 millones, en vivienda, 200 millones, en patrimonio, 24 millones, han sido muchísimas y han ido permitiendo borrar poco a poco las huellas del terremoto y también del Gobierno de España, claro. Aunque seguro que queda mucho por hacer, como nos dirá el alcalde seguro ahora después. Los fondos europeos han permitido atenuar, en muchos casos, las huellas del terremoto en barriadas como La Viña, San José, Apolonia, Virgen de las Huertas, en el casco histórico. Y como en el Ácula y en Amatrice y en otros lugares afectados por terremotos, como antes veíamos, la solidaridad europea ha sido clave para la recuperación. Y termino con una referencia al papel que ha jugado el Parlamento regional, el Parlamento murciano. ¿A qué hacen los parlamentos cuando ocurren estas catástrofes? Lógicamente, la Asamblea Regional de Murcia no ha asistido impasible a los efectos de la catástrofe producida por el terremoto. Ha aprobado leyes, ha tramitado centenares de iniciativas parlamentarias de control e impulso al Gobierno en relación con este seísmo. Ya en diciembre del año 2011 aprobó una ley de medidas fiscales extraordinarias para el municipio de Lorca. En la misma se bonificaban determinados impuestos sobre sucesiones, sobre donaciones en metálico para reconstrucción y adquisición de vivienda habitual, por donación de solares para construcción de vivienda habitual, para la rehabilitación, etc. En mayo de 2012 aprobaba también otra ley regional para autorizar la generación de crédito necesario para la concesión de ayudas, permitiendo incluso la ampliación de esos créditos o de esos fondos destinados a las ayudas si estos resultaban insuficientes a la vista de las solicitudes, ley que fue modificada y ampliada por una nueva ley regional en el año 2014. Y finalmente, dentro del ámbito legislativo, también en julio del año 2018, fue aprobada una ley regional ya en la presente legislatura que tenía por objeto simplificar el procedimiento de justificación por parte de los beneficiarios de la gestión de los fondos recibidos en ayudas para la rehabilitación o reconstrucción de viviendas por parte de los afectados, ampliando asimismo el plazo para hacer efectiva esta justificación en otra ley en el año 2019. El Parlamento Regional, por tanto, ha tramitado y aprobado 5 leyes relacionadas con la gestión de las ayudas para el terremoto y ha tomado acuerdos solicitando la aprobación de los pagos de las mismas, la ampliación de ayudas por alquiler, instando actuaciones para la regeneración urbana de Lorca, la recuperación de su patrimonio cultural histórico y se ha dirigido al Gobierno de España para que éste actuara y abonara las ayudas comprometidas. No puedo enumerar aquí ahora las preguntas o las solicitudes de información que los diputados regionales han planteado y requerido al Gobierno sobre esta catástrofe. Me llevaría horas porque son varios centenares. Pero los diputados de todos los grupos políticos presentes en el arco parlamentario de la región de Murcia, en un asunto tan importante para la comunidad autónoma, han sido capaces de llegar a acuerdos unánimes, de tal forma que las leyes que he mencionado se han aprobado por todos sin excepción. También se ha preocupado el Parlamento de conocer el uso y el destino de las ayudas europeas que se han recibido, de tal forma que los diputados han recibido información sobre el destino del dinero prestado por el Banco Europeo de Inversiones o de la subvención del Fondo Europeo de Solidaridad. Pero el terremoto de Lorca y sus consecuencias, a pesar del tiempo transcurrido, no es un tema olvidado ni solucionado. Quedan muchas cosas por resolver. A fecha del pasado 11 de mayo, 9 años después de la catástrofe, se habían reconstruido 1.200 viviendas, de las que resultaron afectadas, pero aún quedan más de 300 por rehabilitar o reconstruir, y hay muchos edificios pendientes de finalizar la rehabilitación. El artículo 222 del Tratado de la Unión Europea dice que la Unión y sus Estados miembros actuarán conjuntamente con espíritu de solidaridad si un Estado miembro es objeto de un ataque terrorista o víctima de una catástrofe natural. Y en tal caso, dice el Tratado, la Unión movilizará todos los instrumentos de que dispone para prestar asistencia a ese territorio a petición de sus autoridades. La práctica del Fondo de Solidaridad tiene sus claroscuros, ya que la mayoría de las solicitudes no se presentan por catástrofes graves de carácter nacional, sino que pretenden acogerse al criterio de excepcionalidad de catástrofes regionales, lo que, como decía antes, limita la ayuda. Y además el procedimiento para la tramitación no es tan rápido como exigen las crisis que estas catástrofes naturales provocan. Y ello a pesar de la posibilidad existente ahora de la concesión de anticipos. Además, la definición de la normativa comunitaria de lo que es una catástrofe natural que permita la activación del fondo es bastante vaga, porque no existe una noción jurídica internacionalmente aceptada sobre qué debe considerarse tal cosa. Un objetivo fundamental en la gestión de cualquier catástrofe es que, en la medida de lo posible, ésta se pueda prevenir y que éstas, si suceden, se limite de alguna forma los daños lo máximo posible. Enlazar de una manera estrecha el funcionamiento de la solidaridad europea y la gestión de catástrofes naturales, junto con las políticas de lucha contra el cambio climático, seguramente contribuiría a reducir los costes que causan las catástrofes naturales. El cumplimiento de las exigencias constructivas en el diseño de los medios urbanos en las zonas de riesgo sismológico también. El barómetro regional y local anual de la Unión Europea, publicado y presentado el día 12 de este mes por el presidente del Comité de las Regiones, refleja que un 65% de los ciudadanos europeos confían más en los entes locales y regionales por razones de proximidad y eficacia que en otras instituciones. El papel que en el impulso de estas políticas preventivas y de solidaridad han de tener los parlamentos regionales es decisivo, en cuanto estos son instancias más próximas a los ciudadanos. La solidaridad se encuentra en los orígenes y los cimientos de la Unión Europea. La solidaridad plasmada en los textos normativos de la Unión se corresponde con la idea de un compromiso desinteresado y con la convicción de que todos los Estados miembros han de estar asistidos mutuamente en caso de necesidad. Decía el que fue presidente de la Comisión Europea, el señor Juncker, que Europa no puede mantenerse al margen cuando nuestros Estados miembros sufren catástrofes naturales y necesitan ayuda. Ningún país europeo es inmune a las catástrofes, decía él, y cuando éstas se producen, la Unión Europea ha de ofrecer algo más que sus condolencias. Europa es un continente de solidaridad y tenemos que estar mejor preparados, ser más rápidos a la hora de ayudar y hacer efectivo ese principio, como decía, que está en los cimientos de la Unión, de solidaridad y responsabilidad compartida. Esto es lo que los ciudadanos europeos esperan de sus representantes políticos, que son ustedes, los presidentes de los parlamentos, entre otros. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, señora Fernández de Simón. Extraordinaria conferencia para saber qué se hizo, qué se ha hecho y qué se puede hacer. Vamos a hablar de Lorca, ahora centrándonos en esta ciudad tercera de la región de Murcia, con más de 100.000 habitantes y el segundo término municipal más grande de España. Tiene la palabra el alcalde de Lorca, don Diego José Mateos, que es diplomado en Gestión y Administración Pública por la Universidad de Murcia y, a su vez, también lo es en Ciencias Políticas y de la Administración por la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Funcionario de habilitación nacional, hoy ostenta el cargo de alcalde presidente del excelentísimo Ayuntamiento de Lorca desde las pasadas elecciones del mes de junio de 2019. Señor Mateo Molina, bienvenido, buenos días y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente de la Asamblea Regional de Murcia, portavoces de los grupos parlamentarios, diputados regionales, vicealcaldes, ponentes que aportan su visión y su experiencia a esta jornada, y así como un saludo también a todos los participantes que por medios telemáticos nos están siguiendo. Presidente, gracias en nombre de la ciudad de Lorca por la calurosa acogida y bienvenida que siempre recibe en esta casa nuestro Parlamento Autonómico. Gracias de corazón por ejercer de anfitrión en estas interesantísimas jornadas que se organizan en la Asamblea Regional, en la que Lorca se convierte en el objeto fundamental de las mismas. Por tanto, me veo en la necesidad de extender la gratitud de todos los ciudadanos y ciudadanas de Lorca, 94.000 agradecimientos, tantos como lorquinos y lorquinas, a su presidente de la Asamblea Regional, Alberto Castillo, por poner a Lorca en el foco y, en primer lugar, acordarse de Lorca para tratar y abordar una temática relacionada con las catástrofes naturales. En segundo lugar, por tener la valentía, la iniciativa y el aplomo de llevarlas a cabo en las circunstancias en las que nos vemos envueltos en la actualidad. Cuando hace ya unos meses el presidente Castillo vino a visitarnos al Ayuntamiento de Lorca para plantearnos la realización de estas jornadas, he de confesar que me pareció una brillantísima idea y que no había mejor escenario que el de Lorca para ser sede de estas jornadas. Obviamente, la reciente historia de Lorca nos hace ser los más indicados para abordar cuestiones relacionadas con los desastres y catástrofes naturales. Desgraciadamente, la actual situación derivada de la pandemia ocasionada por la COVID-19, cuyas consecuencias también son de índole desastrosa y catastrófica, está generando una profunda crisis social y económica, no solo en nuestro país y en Europa, sino también a nivel global por todo el planeta, por lo que ha determinado que estas jornadas no puedan celebrarse en la Ciudad del Sol. No obstante, aunque vivimos días intensos combatiendo al virus, centrando todos nuestros esfuerzos en doblegar la cadena de contagio, destinando a este objetivo los principales recursos económicos y humanos del Ayuntamiento de Lorca, hemos sido capaces de encontrar este momento para organizar de una manera magistral e impecable estas jornadas y otros para participar como ponentes en las mismas. Por todo ello, ya antes de entrar en materia, quiero también manifestar mi agradecimiento, reconocimiento y consideración a la Conferencia de Asambleas Legislativas de las Regiones de Europa, Calre, conformada por sus 74 parlamentos autonómicos de los distintos países de la Unión Europea, órgano presidido por el señor Matos Expósito, a la sazón, presidente del Parlamento de las Islas Canarias. Asimismo, aprovecho la ocasión para mandar un afectuoso saludo a todas las personas que nos acompañan, tanto hoy aquí presencialmente, en este bello patio de las comarcas, y también a quienes nos están siguiendo a través de los medios telemáticos desde sus respectivos despachos, lugares de trabajo, hogares, etc. Como ya se ha mencionado en el acto de apertura,
as mentioned before in the opening act, the aim today is to deal in a cross-cutting way the aftermath of a natural disaster, under the title of Seismic Disasters, the Locust Earthquake, History of a Reconstruction. And that's what we started to do after this sad day, May 11th, 2011. So the title of my conference is The Recovery of a Destroyed City. And that's what we are about to do with our citizens, what we've done in the last 9 years after the earth shook and it crumbled and it did away with dreams, with feelings, and with lives. On May 11th, well, it was a normal day on the City of Sun, and day workers were going to pick the fruits, and then the industrial streets were vibrant, the shops were open, and the schools were filled with life. It was a normal day. We were happy in our own way, and we were ignorant of what was coming to us. At 5 past 5. There was a 4.5 shake in the city, and we were all aware that a very important seismic incident had happened. There were some elements falling to the floor, some cracks in some buildings, and then many appliances were destroyed. Then we heard the sirens, the emergency vehicles, and we knew that the earthquake was important and had caused damage. Many locals went out to the streets to do an eye count of the initial damage. We were talking about the intensity of the quake, but then we went back to normal in a way. We couldn't imagine what was to come. At 6:47, the clock stopped at Lorca. The earth shook, and it cracked, and it rocked the whole city for 5 very long seconds. 5 seconds that all locals will remember forever. So there was all chaos, confusion, drama, and dust from the rubbles, from the streets, from the avenues, from the squares of Lorca. A dust that surrounded Lorca in a very apocalyptic image that we've probably seen in many films. That was caused by a 5.2 earthquake with the epicenter in the outskirts of the city at the La Tercia mountain range at a depth, and therefore the damage, a depth of only 1 kilometer, and therefore the damage. And then the city was destroyed. Damages are huge to buildings, to heritage, and to public infrastructures. So we got very confused news on the reach and the intensity of the quake. We were very aware of the damage, compounded by the initial earthquake that brought us to the brink. And then unfortunate news arrived. We all learned of the deceased people, 9 people in particular, 9 stories that broke our hearts, 9 lives lost forever on May 11th, 2018. From here, I'd like to pay homage to all the people who died during the earthquake. These are 9 pins, 9 needles that pierce through our hearts every single time we remember this earthquake. These are 9 lives that we can't substitute and which embody the tragedy and the collective trauma that we suffered. This experience had a long-lasting effect on us, and we still feel the consequences in our city. But Lorca is still Lorca. We are not defeated. We took a severe blow that could have broke the citizens, but we are still there. We're tumbling, but we are still standing. And that's where we start the story of the reconstruction of this wonderful city with wonderful people. And I'm talking about Lorca and the Lorca population. So this is the minute 0 on the reconstruction. So we grabbed the bull by the horns, and we took on the challenge of rebuilding a destroyed city. Very quickly, from the council, we launched the emergency plan, and the regional government started the level 2 for the plan with Sismimur, and from the government delegation, 350 specialists from the UME came to Lorca, and from the ministry, the Home Ministry, several teams were mobilized, including police and Guardia Civil units. So a tracking and evaluation committee is created, and then we instantly receive the solidarity from other towns, other councils, and other institutions, both public and private. Despite the initial chaos, there were different administration levels which activated their protocols and in a coordinated way adapted and made the first decisions. The first diagnosis out of the first few hours was that there were 9 casualties. 20,000 people were displaced due to the tectonic movement. Many had to flee to the second residence in the nearby, on the coast or in the mountain range. And then on May 13th, the government of Spain passed a royal decree whereby urgent measures are launched, including several applications in just a few days. 710 for the rebuilding of houses, 200 for repair, over 1,000 for the rental of new homes, 145 for house appliance aid. We are talking about over 3,000 files that were submitted to mutual insurance companies and which already in that year disbursed 110 million euros. 800 destroyed buildings, 800 homes which disappeared, 300 families which were displaced, and 150 that had to be moved to the camp at La Torrecilla. These are cold figures, but stress the challenge that the city had to face after this profound crisis. On May 12th, Lorca is grounded to a halt. There is no economic activity, trade, agriculture, commerce, they all ground to a halt. No one can work because there are no working conditions, and many are displaced. And then we start counting and analyzing the damage of the earthquake. Regarding public infrastructure, we are talking about the destroyed headquarters of Guardia Civil and the police constabulary, and then damages to the public transport, and then the railways also in the tribunals, and then the Lorca Águila railways that were stopped until the beginning of July. And also in schools, 12 schools were closed down, and over 6,000 students in primary, secondary, and university degrees had to be relocated elsewhere in different towns so that they could finish their academic year. We're talking about several municipalities with 3,000 students that couldn't attend school until the next year. The secondary school, Mr. Giner, had to be demolished. Other institutes had the same luck, and the Ibáñez Martínez Institute had structural damage requiring for immediate action. And then the official conservatory was damaged to the point that students had to move to Puerto Lumbreras, nearby. The initial situation was chaotic and quite difficult in the following months, with problems also in the following academic year. In public buildings, the social impact was high, both on the economic and social level, especially for NGOs, foster homes, children homes. So basically, all public organisms required for aid from the public institutions. As for our heritage, our city center was declared World Heritage Site in 1968, therefore protecting the most important buildings, for example, the Collegiata, the castle, the Guevara Palace and the Baroque churches, as well as other areas and buildings which are beautiful as, as stated in this royal decree. Also the huge manor house in the historic center, which embodies the economic power and artistic power of the region, was most affected by the earthquake. Also churches, an emblem of Lorca, were also highly affected in the facades, in the belfries, to the point that we couldn't attend such temples. Also, therefore, the damage was huge. We need to consider that Lorca is a vibrant city, highly dependent on tourism, which is also deeply rooted in our traditions. Also, for example, the Easter activities and celebrations are very important, and these were also disrupted. And many areas couldn't be used anymore for such celebrations. Also, the castle, a symbol of the city, is also affected, and we can feel its consequences on the Espolón Tower, which crumbled down after the second shake. And then the Guevara Palace, one of the most notable buildings in the city, well, was affected structurally, and we had to move the heritage and the painting collection elsewhere. So without further ado, the Guerra Theater, the casino, well, these were just but some of the damages suffered by the city. And, well, all these images made the headlines due to the spectacularity. And I'm talking about the San Diego church and the damages, something that happened live on TV. Or the Virgen de la Huerta Tower, which also crumbled down live on TV. And then the Santiago church, whose image you can see behind me, well, the dome collapsed moments after the children were evacuated, children rehearsing for the first communion. We can't really imagine the tragedy that could have ensued. And also, this dome turned around and collapsed. And lastly, the San Francisco church, whose tower was severely affected, and it was tilted to the point that we had to think about knocking it down. So this was the landscape, the aftermath of after this earthquake. In the following weeks, actually, Lorca has no trade, no public services, the industrial sector is not operative, and workers can't go to their office. So the Lorca's reconstruction pivots around the renovation of damaged houses, knocking down and rebuilding buildings, the regeneration of public spaces, and the recovery and restoration of the historical, artistic, and historic heritage. Regarding damaged buildings, damaged houses, more than 26,000 files were submitted to the insurance companies, which give you an idea of the damage. In most cases, well, there were no trouble as these homes had a home insurance. But where we faced problems was when we had to knock down and rebuild buildings with structural damages, mainly regarding the residential building reconstruction, where there was multi-property, thus difficult in the decision-making. So we had to arbitrate and agree on judicial measures. As agreed before, with the assembly and the regional government, and these specific judicial measures led to the expropriation of those who were not interested in knocking down the building and thus delaying the need for new homes. After these obstacles, Lorca got back its skyline and some new buildings were created. Sorry, but we've lost the sound from the speaker.
Poco se podía hacer para reparar las heridas que el terremoto había ocasionado. Afortunadamente, tanto el Gobierno de la Nación como la Comunidad Autónoma de la Región de Murcia, así como las instituciones europeas, han contribuido de manera sobresaliente a la financiación.
Sorry, we have no incoming sound.
En este capítulo quiero hacer especial hincapié en el agradecimiento que los lorquinos y lorquinas mostramos por la participación y la implicación del Gobierno de España en un primer momento.
We were very grateful for the government of Spain's aid, as per the above-mentioned decree, also to the European institutions and European Investment Bank. And these are our influence in the urban design of Lorca. We are working in the outskirts, in the main avenues, La Viña, Cervantes, Alfonso X. And these were possible thanks to the European Investment Bank. And we should stress how important the coordination was with the regional and local governments so that we could manage the funds coming from European solidarity. In this regard, we shouldn't ignore the construction of evacuation routes. That was essential for the transformation of our city. It's a huge avenue that as a U-ring, that a ring road will help move around the city without actually driving through the city center. So this is an ambitious project that has overcome several obstacles that we still have to overcome. And then these works, these infrastructures required a great deal of time. We've had to ask for several extensions to Brussels, and I think we should require and apply for more because we are only completed 1 or 4. We could talk for hours about this, but I don't think we have the time. So regarding the recovery, the restoration of heritage, well, we can be proud and look up. The splendor of Lorca's heritage shines as never before. We should admit that earthquakes came with a unique opportunity to go about a very ambitious project to renew the city. We're talking about infrastructures. So we should recognize that the damages done to our heritage were also a historic opportunity to renew and restore our cultural heritage, which is especially important. Damages to our heritage had a huge social and economic impact, even though our richness lies on the agroalimentary sector, also the services sector are really important. Initially, tourists disappear. No one could visit Lorca because all their buildings and heritage were either closed down or in a ruinous state. We have firm commitment with the recovery of the heritage under the governance plan, and this allowed Lorca to recover their heritage, which is now one of the best kept in Spain. It's actually a paradox, but you can witness this if you come to Lorca and then you contemplate our heritage. There's still plenty to do, but we've progressed a great deal. The Espolón Tower and the castle got back their initial splendor and are the emblem of Lorca, and also the Baroque churches are shining again. The Guevara Palace is still the most important Baroque building here, and its patio has again hosted institutional events. The Guerra Theater now hosts again paintings, and the medieval walls bring us back to the old times where Lorca was the border, and also the council, the churches, and well, this could be an endless list, and we brought back all of them to their initial splendor. And with this, tourism is back in Lorca. Also, restoration and services are back. However, we still need to work on the city center's manor house restoration. And many buildings in the city center require for further work. In our city center, we have a drive for economic diversification so that we are not so dependent on the private sector. And we need to renovate this to make it attractive again so that it's a place to live for people again, to ensure that there are new services. All in all, Lorcans want a vibrant city center. To conclude, I like to stress that the restoration of Lorca was possible thanks to the sacrifice and the efforts of Lorca local population, and well, we're still standing after these two unfortunate events and the floods also affecting our city later on. But we should stress that the public administration at all levels, local, regional, and national, and also at the European level, have made possible that Lorca is still at the forefront of the region, influencing not just the Murcia region, but other regions, south of Spain, the Vélez, Almería, and other neighboring areas. To conclude, I'd like to thank all participants for your attention, and hoping that this will be a fruitful conference and that will be at your entire disposal in case you need any further clarification, questions, comments on all the points I've touched upon. Thank you.
No doubt, Mr. Mateos' speech has taken us to the time tunnel, and those who unfortunately underwent that disaster, those who had to be witness of the earthquake firsthand, has taken us to this tunnel, and he's moving words has taken us to May 2011, a city that was erected at the site of the Alama Fault, but as we mentioned earlier, and as the mayor has mentioned, has underwent natural disasters throughout history, including floods, for example. We were reminded of that some 17 years ago in the Novalte, the water course, and when the city had not yet awoken from the 2011 tragic earthquake. 1 year later, there were tragic floods that literally devastated the very beautiful city of sun, as we call it in Murcia, the city of the sun for each and every citizen of Murcia. This has been therefore, a comprehensive and detailed explanation of Lorca before, during the disaster, and the aftermath too. I would like to thank Mr. Mateos very much for being here. There's a home of the Parliament in this room where these semi-face-to-face, semi-remote meetings are taking place. Some speakers are present here. Others will be connecting remotely, so it's a semi-face-to-face meeting. This is not what we would have liked. We would have liked to hold this here in person to show the world this beautiful city, and we're proud of this city since an image is worth 1,000 words. The Lorca town hall has put together for you a brief video that seeks to portray the city before, during, and after May 11th. So how the city was before that date, what happened on that day, and the current status on 20 October 2020. For those of you who are not aware of the magnitude of that tragedy, those who did not live this tragedy firsthand or followed can now see what happened via this video. Lorca. At least 2 dead this afternoon in Lorca, Murcia, following 2 strong earthquakes. Talk about 5 dead. There have been 2 quakes, one at 4:30 p.m., 5.4 degrees in Richter scale, and a second quake of 5.1 Richter scale has been so strong it's been felt in other areas, including Albacete, Madrid, and Almeria. Careful, careful. You've just seen how this has fallen down, people screaming. 9 dead. $324 injured. The 2 quakes have given way to numerous damages. Destroyed houses. Historic heritage seriously damaged. Lorca earthquake is the most serious event of the kind in Spain in the last 30 years. Many households were demolished. Solidarity. Rebuilding. Houses, public buildings, stores, heritage. neighborhoods, public spaces, infrastructures.
Dos personas han muerto esta tarde en Lorca, en Murcia, tras dos fuertes terremotos. Hay quien habla de ya de 5 víctimas mortales. La verdad es que han sido dos los temblores, uno de ellos a las 4:30 de la tarde, de 4,5 grados en la escala Richter, y un segundo, solo 3 horas después, de 5,1. Ha sido tan fuerte que se ha notado también en otras zonas como en Albacete, en Madrid o en Almería.
Miren, se está cayendo, cuidado, cuidado. Estáis viendo cómo se acaba de derrumbar todo, los gritos.
Los dos temblores han provocado abundantes daños materiales. El terremoto de Lorca ha sido el suceso más grave de este tipo en los últimos 30 años en España.
Seguimos con esta jornada.
Let's move on with this meeting organized by the Murcia Regional Assembly to shed light on what happened before, during, and after May 2011 in Lorca. Lorca, history of reconstruction or rebuilding, and from the region of Murcia, the regional parliament of Murcia, which is located in the 3,000-year-old city of Cartagena, is depicting for Europe what happened following those tragic dates and the beautiful reality of today's time, as I mentioned at the beginning, to give the floor to the media, journalists, the voice of reporters of the media in Murcia, which paid witness those days and live on a daily basis disasters and catastrophes, and they have to cover this. They also give good news, but we want to hear how they adjust their daily work when faced with natural disasters. We have with us the director of the Dean Media in the region of Murcia, the head of the La Verdad newspaper, Mr. Aguirre de Calre, a newspaper that has 120 years history and is a reference medium for generations. We also have with us the director of the Dean Radio Broadcasting Company, Cadena SER, broadcasting radio channel opened in 1933, and therefore it's the oldest in the region, and have been informing through the waves millions of Murcians, generation after generation. And then we need the television, our own regional television. I say our because it's 7 TV, and it's the region's television company, and its president Antonio Peña Rubia will be here with us. So we have newspapers, radio, and television represented here to see how they covered the natural event and the aftermath. This roundtable will be moderated by the journalist Lucia Hernandez Aguilar, and she now has the floor. Ms. Hernandez, Lucia, we're thrilled to have the four of you here, this site being the home of all Murcians. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Alberto Castillo, President of the Regional Parliament, reporter and colleague. We're holding this meeting called A History of Reconstruction. We'll discuss, with the perspective provided by the time elapsed, the rebuilding from the media standpoint, how this natural catastrophe, this natural disaster was addressed by the written press, by the radio and television media, and see how the media take on risks, reaction, fear, people, and how they cover people, which are at the heart of everything we do. The immediacy, resilience, journalism, the human journalism with the skin, and this is deeply linked with the pandemic that is undergo. So we have some reporters here, and we want to hear what they have to say, how they lived in so far as their alma mater, their companies, to see how they covered this and how they lived this, because they had to manage reporters who not only reported but were affected, impacted from left to right. Let's start with Antonio Peñarrubia, public state-owned broadcasting company. What lessons learned? Well, I would like to begin by thanking Alberto Castillo, the president of the regional parliament, for having me, and I would like to greet one and all at the regional television. Back in the day, I was not general manager there, but I just published the news, and the first thing that popped to mind when you were talking was people. Antonio Beltran, who's a seasoned reporter, was there, and he was also impacted, by the way, that May 11th himself, that time when the quakes happened, and with a phone call knowing that his wife and child who were in one of the affected houses were okay. He started covering the news, and with great technical difficulties, mind you, because in 10 years, broadcasting television has changed greatly. We had large trucks back in the day, and it was difficult to take them to certain places, let alone to a city covered by rubble. Look, well, you can now do this with just a cell phone. So there was a great difficulty in those days, but I remember how all the employees at our media were fully committed to covering this. Even our colleague that was directly affected, but everybody went there to Lorca and started explaining what was going on. Reporters, people think, are there to describe what happens, but that day, everybody, including the media, really achieved to have a special link between what had happened and the, say, casualties and everybody at the end of the day, because we were there to tell people whether it was safe or not to leave their homes, to go out on the streets, to echo what the emergency officials were instructing. And I think that the television played an important role, and we were really, say, we felt a great reward because of the feelings shown to us by the public, and it was a very difficult point in time. May 11. Okay, thank you, Antonio. Let's see how the radio broadcasting company lived this, and I'd like to focus on the immediacy that was necessary to broadcast this. I'd like to thank the president of the Murcia Regional Parliament and the rest of the public authorities for being here and for having here. And we heard that Lorca was exemplary in many things, among which it's the rebuilding process and going back to normality. Many things were done well, but there is still a lot to do. As for what happened 9 years ago, on May 11, 2011, remember what happened in the radio. I feel slightly embarrassed because our moderator today was part of the Cadena Ser team in that fatal date, and Mr. Alberto Castillo, now president of the regional parliament, was the head of the regional division of the station. So I normally say that the media proved fundamental in life, and that day it was useful for a number of reasons. We need strong media with capillarity across our territory so that we can go fast when something occurs, so that we can say, give an account firsthand and not go through third parties. Cadena Ser, fortunately, had a powerful, a strong team in Lorca. Things have changed, by the way. We'll discuss that later on. From the first quake, we had a reporter who came in, Lázaro Jiménez. He was on duty that afternoon at 5:15 approximately. He came in live in this show called La Ventana. The anchor was Gemma Nierga, and he started talking about normality, about a threat and people outdoors. It was a good and bad. Being outdoors prevented further casualties, but that that grouping of people gave way to fatality, like that young child who was walking the dog. And I've always said that, well, of course, newspapers, you can reflect more, and television allows for a greater quality. But I'm proud of this, that we can do at radio station, which is being immediate. Lázaro then covered a second news, but Maika Sanchez, who also lived this really firsthand and under very difficult personal circumstances, she was collaborating with a local television. I think it no longer exists. But let us not forget that this was was the run-up to the local and regional election. So there was going to be a debate among 7 candidates. That of Izquierda Unida had not yet arrived. They were waiting for the debate to begin. When this happened, the debate was cancelled, and she went out to see what was going on. Then the second quake happened, and when reporters were already there, and at 8 p.m. We had sent out a mobile unit, and Alberto Ruiz was there. He's the head of contest now. There was the sports show. There was a sports show that had to that was to happen, but they started covering the earthquake. And in the morning, Carlos Francino, the head of that famous TV show, arrived in Lorca. A little later, Ángels Barceló, the head of the news in Cadena Ser, arrived there too. And one of the so some of the media took a little some time for them to get there, because most of the lanes in the freeway were devoted to ambulance traffic. So we only had one lane to get there, but we proved essential, and we were devoted to informing the population, because it was total chaos. At the beginning, we thought that the mobile posts had been damaged, but there were problems with the telecom, because many were trying to contact their relatives at the same time. And of course, technology back then was different. And now we can broadcast at all times. We managed to broadcast back then also, and we provided important information and important information for all citizens. And let me finish by saying that we've never forgotten Lorca, and we have been very belligerent and demanding that the aid the compensation came through, and we never forget, because reporters are not made of steel or ice, and it was difficult personally for them. Well, thank you, Camacho. Okay, so let's now move to Alberto Díaz de Carter, who's the head of La Verdad, the newspapers. So, telling the truth, immediacy. I think that we should also pay tribute to the technicians who had to capture what happened with a camera, be it a video camera or a photographic camera, to move away from sensational press. Well, good morning. That is not yet behind us all fully, because as with other media, we don't leave after some days. We are still here. Our commitment is unquestionable. We're here for our people. You were discussing photographers and video cameramen and women. I think that what we saw, it was the consequence of everything done by Agencia F and La Verdad, Nacho Garcia, Israel Sanchez, that took some of the best pictures, and they were recognized. Their work was exceptional. When the first quake happened, we had just put together the front page, and we requested that the civil society representatives contributed. Nacho Ruiz was there with us that day. We were portraying information about the first quake, and some reporters and photographers had already gotten on cars to get there. And when I arrived in my office that had recently been renovated, and where everything was in glass, and we could feel that the shock. So I realized firsthand that something serious had happened. So I started thinking about the people who lived in Lorca and the people we've sent out on site. And when Israel Sanchez and Nacho got there, well, they were faced with the 5.1 quake, the second one. Fortunately, Pilar Baz was in a convent, was able to leave the building right before it collapsed. Paco Alonso, our photographer, Lorca, his home was affected. It had to be demolished the following day. So it was a true shock. Indeed, at that point in time, you realize that you are surrounded by true professionals, and everybody goes through the motions because they know what they need to do. And that team had been ready for that. Everybody knew what they had to do, and we were devoting effort to our website. So we had been working hard, rigorously, and fast, because our internet portal was a reference for a number of media in other regions that were not in Murcia. They would access our website to get information. I received calls from Latin America. They wanted to know what had happened, and we got calls from Europe. There was international interest because back in the day we didn't know, but at 7:30 p.m., as we've heard earlier, cell phones didn't work, but we changed everything around in the newspaper, and we put together 17 pages in a very short period of time. We were as professional as we could. The following day, we published 30 pages, and so on. So it was a unique experience that if only it had never happened. I visited the area a couple days later, and I attended the funeral. and it looked like a battlefield. It was really tough. Well, I'll tell you more about this. What I want to underscore, it would be, on the one hand, that this is not over, that we need to be there with the citizens of Lorca to accompany them in the recovery process, that I think the European Investment Bank's loans come to a termination next year, but we're going to be with them all the time.
Before a very formal question, a more spontaneous one. Did you, in different media companies, we've spoken about public TV on the one side, the radio on the other side, but there was some feedback, some interconnection between the media, right? And that competition was fictional, really, on the surface. And I think the press was feeding back on the radio and the other way around. And then we showed that the press is very united. But I'd like you to explain this feedback that was between the different media outlets. Well, in any communication outlet, you need to be connected with other colleagues. In the regional TV, we're always listening to some local radio stations and with the news bulletin. And so we update the La Verdad website. That's part of our DNA, of any journalist DNA. And for example, that morning I had the chance to visit the TV studios, and there were two TVs, with the one with the La Siete and the Spanish public TV. So personally, I like to foster this environment of a special relationship between different colleagues with whom we have common objectives. Of course, we also compete, but we are also sharing. It's a virtuous competition, I would say. I fully agree. Well, in the first few moments, well, you didn't have time to check what others were doing. It was like the pace was so fast that you just had to ensure that you had the sufficient medium to be live on air, and then, well, in the following days, yes, we had this very moving moment. And then when you have the time, then you take a different newspaper and then you start reading other pieces of journalism. Of course, we are in contact with other colleagues, but we also compete because you need to know what others are doing and what you might be missing out on. And well, this was always a referential medium here, and also the local TV has doing an excellent job. So we have to keep an eye on each other to know what we are doing. But back then we had a very well-defined sector. Now we are more cross-cutting. For example, Alberto, La Verdad director, he said that through the website they had a more actual, more current news outlet, unlike the printed media. And well, now, on top of the radio, the printed newspaper, we also have very powerful websites so that we can be the go-to outlet when people are looking for news. So we always need to keep an eye on all the main media. And well, that's what we did, but not initially. Initially, we didn't have the time to look elsewhere. Yes, we didn't have the time. So if you like your job, you like to see other colleagues' work, to learn from what they do, from your own mistakes. But during those moments, you don't have time. You need to focus. You need to send the news at a certain time with a tight deadline. And it's all about credibility, that your information is reliable. So we always go for a close shave, and then we published the 8 casualties. Unfortunately, there were 9. So your utmost concern is to provide a public service. Like when there is a flood, you are only thinking in providing most reliable information. And also, choosing the right pictures was really important. Some of them really hard to publish, and there was no information justification for that. So those decisions had to be made very quickly in that moment. And I was most impressed by the work of my colleagues. Well, they were on the right boat with the right captain, as I realized. They were spot on with their work. So what has changed? Have we learned from the local experience for the natural disaster experience? We could talk about Lorca, the Alcázares, or the current moment in the second COVID wave. Has that transformed us as professionals? And if so, how has that changed? Can we talk about a fact-based journalism, and then with a new horizon, which is like a skin, a feeling journalism where there is no sensationalism? What have we learned from this? What's our current challenge? Well, yeah, when nature tested us 10 years ago, and then 2 years ago with the torrential rains, and now with the pandemic, well, we realize that that danger of natural disasters is always there, and we need to be ready. So I'd like to stress the value of the public and private media outlets. And since this is a continental event for the whole of Europe, and we have reporters from different regions and local professionals, I'd like to urge them to have a firm commitment with having very solid and robust media outlets, be it public or private. And today, our daily work is essential. But in these cases that is so close to the life of our citizens, well, having well-prepared media outlets, being as prepared as the emergency services, that's very important. And that's not done in a day. If tomorrow we have a wildfire, it's not just about calling some firefighters here and there. You need to have a well-equipped and well-trained professional teams. And same applies to journalism. Like in our case, 10 years ago, we had very reliable media. People believed their news. And they were in constant contact with the emergency services. And then we saw it again with the floodings, with the torrential rains suffered in this region. And then again with the pandemic. We are representing a few media outlets who are constantly in contact with the citizens. I think this is not the result of just chance. It's the result of work, of administrations and companies who had a firm commitment with this idea. And therefore, I'd like to encourage all citizens who might be listening or reading to us in the next few minutes that they use good media outlets like La Verdad. And then they resort to reliable information sources such as Cadena Ser. That's the only way we have to guarantee our service. Yes, I fully agree on this need of having solid and independent media. You were asking what has changed. Well, the initial impact, the most important impact was the earthquakes. But nationally and internationally, we see tragedies happening every day, and the earthquakes in Italy and previously in Spain. Yes, this was a seminal moment in our region, but in our station, Cadena Ser, the Murcia experience with daily updates, well, that was replicated when there was the train accident in Santiago, northwest of Spain. And I'm happy that that was replicated and they were granted an award for that. And then the killings in Barcelona. And then the Madrid team got back very quickly to start recording programs. So these types of events will always happen. And then I agree with my colleague, we need solid media to report on that. Well, regarding experiences, well, we are maybe harsher, we are more resilient. And then I remember later on we had the floodings, and they won this program at Ground Zero in Murcia, Esparragal. And these were very terrible experiences, but make you harder, stronger as a journalist, as a reporter. Well, we had to cover not just the news, but the aftermath. And this was important to pressure public entities to ensure that affected people would receive the aid. And then there were several stages. Well, some stages when you start receiving better news than the initial news. And then there was a recent report on the heritage that we had restored in the city. Is a multifaceted story with many angles. And Lorcans, well, you know, there was also a wave of solidarity that was unprecedented in Murcia, maybe also in Spain. And our work there was trying to channel all that, help coordinate a race that's still happening for funding or helping artists to paint 12 paintings that then were auctioned. And then we worked with local media outlets. And that's very important because we are deeply rooted in the area. For example, Facebook won't be sending anyone to Murcia. They don't have, or Twitter. Twitter is not going to send anyone to Lorca or any city in Murcia to tell things on the ground. So what we need to ensure is that this is done locally and the benefit remains locally. And we can see the work of many photographers risking their lives. They see that the pictures then are used elsewhere by, well, we don't know whom, on social media. And therefore, I'd like to vindicate that if we want to preserve this, if we don't want to have a desert of local news, as it is the case in the US, we need to protect and stress the value of the local media outlets, the current one and the future ones. So citizens must be demanding with their media, which are essential. Okay, with one eye on the clock. And the clock is our main leader in the media. We are always fighting against the clock. And then this question is a very personal, but also professional one. What challenges are you facing in your media, the public and the private ones? Are we seeing a new horizon opening up for science, for society, and for communication? Are we communicating properly? And what's the best way to communicate? I know it's a very complex question to be dealt with in just a few minutes, but I'd like you to reflect on us, opinion leaders and people who were on the ground during the earthquake. Well, given the news in the last few months and with the pandemic, the biggest challenge of the media is to fight against fake news. I think when we see such disasters, there's plenty of fake news that can be fatal. Last year, with the storms, well, some people, they would posting on social media all sorts of news which were not double-checked. And that information was false. So the biggest challenge ahead for the media is to win the battle against the lies, against social media fostering fake news. We see the situation in the US, in the electoral campaign. Well, the country is rife with lies, and it's important that citizens understand that information must come from professional media with solid professionals who are properly paid so that they don't need to leave their companies. Those media, given the current challenges, COVID, natural disasters, or future challenges, well, we need to be able to show the official line, to share the official line. And we are broadcasting live all the official statements by the health officials. And then we obviously break it down because time is of the essence on TV. But we are always providing information from official sources and always construing or interpreting these news with healthcare professionals. It's not just about someone talking about a Boston-based doctor who said that the masks are good or are bad. No, we have excellent healthcare professionals and researchers in Spain and in Europe who we can ring up and we can double-check information with them. And that's what can be most harmful for us. Sometimes messages don't get across. And I can really believe that there's still people on the street without a mask, or young people who are scared from what they read on the social media. And sometimes the messages are not sent across and don't make it to their final recipients. And the citizens should value how important it is to have solid media like the ones we have in Murcia, Cadena Ser, La Verdad, with very professional journalists and reporters working locally, finding first-hand information and stuffing away the unnecessary stuff. And that's the biggest challenge that we are facing. We need to pass on that message to our audience, our citizens. Well, every time we meet, we end up talking about this and the importance of social media and also the photographers, Facebook, fake news. Okay, talking about Lorca again. We had a colleague that in the first few moments said that there was an irrigation pool about to burst its banks, and that wasn't double checked, and therefore that created a great deal of concern in a certain area in Murcia, and that was bad practice that could have led to other tragedies. And we see this very often, and I insist. We need to provide reliable and accurate information, and we need to respect other professionals' work. And regarding our coverage, I'm going to be critical, and we're doing a huge effort. 80% of our reporters are working on the topic, leaving aside other topics, and I insist, we are abusing, if I may call it, if I may use this term, we're abusing the figures. Figures are cold numbers, and they don't reflect anything other than statistics. Infected people per 100,000 inhabitants. So we need some pedagogy to write more human stories. What we see is that figures don't sensitize citizens and don't create and raise awareness in the citizenship, which is what we need. So we need a different perspective. I fully agree with my colleague. We need, after so many months of lockdown and working remotely, we need reporters, journalism on the streets again to see the side effects of certain conditions so that we can show the face of the main protagonists here, which are the citizens. And when we talk about the numbers, the curves, well, we lose perspective. And for me, that's an obsession. We wanted to use a narrative with the involvement of families. That was the only way to sensitize, to raise awareness. We were affected by the pandemic like anyone else, and currently the value of truth is questioned by some leaders, like the leader of the main world's power. So if we don't get back some sacred values, we'll face a problem as a society. We will never agree on the same objective fact due to a possible ideological bias. And that's something we need to get back to work more rigorously. And well, probably we are also doing something wrong if we are not able to raise awareness. But we need to continue working. So we'll conclude the roundtable with the media. We've spoken to Alberto Aguirre de Cárcer, Director of La Verdad de Murcia, Domingo Camacho Fernández, Regional Director of Cadena SER, Antonio Peñarrubia Caravaca, Director of the local TV 7TV. Stressing the importance of the nearby journalism, the local periodism, the truth and the facts against fake news. And we like to remember that this is everyone's house and this is part of the house of democracy. Thank you very much. We will meet again and we will deal with journalism again. Thank you, Ms. Hernández. Thank you, Mr. Aguirre de Cárcer, Camacho Fernández, and Peñarrubia Caravaca for participating in this roundtable. Since we started with the thanks, I'd like to now thank our followers, our audience on social media. And I feel very emotional. We have a firefighting team that using the hashtag that we launched from the regional assembly, which is Lorca Reconstrucción, Lorca Reconstruction. The firefighting team, they are paying homage to what happened back in May 2011, and they are actively participating on social media through what they're hearing and reviving again this morning during this Calre conference. And then, well, we've mentioned firefighters this morning, and the mayor of Lorca has paid them homage as a chairman of this parliament and coordinator of this working group. Would like also to pay a very emotional homage to the UME, the military emergency unit, the healthcare professionals, the Guardia Civil, also the firefighters, who worked intensively on May 11th, 2011. And those following us on the social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, I'd like to thank them from the bottom of our hearts for the seminal importance of this conference and the repercussion and the scope of this conference. And we want to take this story to all the corners of the old European continent. And we will proceed with the next guest. And then we'll have online José Jesús Martínez Díaz, with a degree in geological sciences, with a major in dynamic geology, structural and dynamic geology by the Complutense University of Madrid in 1989. He's focused his scientific work in the research and determination of faults in the vertical mountain range, especially the Alhama fault. He's General Director for Research of Planetary Geodynamics and Active Tectonics and Risk Applications at the Complutense University of Madrid. He will illustrate us on the Alhama fault, the sad protagonist of the earthquake. Dear Professor Martinez, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us on this Calre conference that are being followed by the European regional parliaments making up this confederation, the Calre. Professor Martinez, good morning. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for this kind invitation to this very interesting event. Thank you to the Regional Murcia Assembly and to the Calre Group. And basically, my lecture will be a technical one. I hope I won't be too boring, but I just want to share some ideas on the reasons behind the earthquakes in Murcia and other regions. Well, what we've learned from previous earthquakes and try to explain what we are doing to deal with future seismic events. So I've prepared this presentation that I'll be sharing on the screen. So I hope you can see it properly. I think you can see it. Please correct me if not.
Como decía, el objetivo de mi ponencia.
The aim of my lecture today, above all, I'll have to say that apart from working in this group, I'm coordinating a research project based on the Alhama fault in Murcia. I'm coordinating 3 projects based on the parameterization and monitoring of this fault in Murcia. I'll explain the tasks that we are carrying out so that we understand the scientific methodology we should follow to understand what happens with the earthquakes in the region. So there will be 4 sections. The first is a theoretical one. Some slides will be quite technical. I will touch upon them very quickly, and then here I'll explain that earthquakes are generated by active faults, and we need to study these faults to monitor them and understand how they behave. as they have their own trades. And then I will speak about the Lorca earthquake and the Alhama fault. And lastly, I'll explain the scientific methodology, as well with other aspects, about prevention and monitoring and surveillance of these faults looking forward. Something very important, I think you'll have in mind that earthquakes are produced due to tectonic plates. And here we have this map, and most earthquakes happen on the borders of the plates because these are moving plates. And then in the friction areas, we have tension accumulating and thus creating the existence of faults. So that's where we are, between the Euro-Asian and the African plates, and this creates tension and friction, creating also tension, and therefore we have the faults. This is the world map of active faults that you can check online. And on this map, well, we zoom in on the Mediterranean area. We see many active faults. This is not a comprehensive list. We see many faults in the eastern Mediterranean, but also in the Iberian Peninsula, especially southwest, in the Beticul mountain range, where the Murcia region is located. So if we zoom in, based on the data we have in Spain, the active fault database that we have in Europe, including in Spain, in Iberia, including Spain, in Portugal, we have traces of all the active faults that have been identified, and these are some in Murcia. We have the Alhama fault around the Guadalentín Valley, but then there are other very interesting ones, and that can be very dangerous, like the Carrascoy fault and the Palomares fault. The most active ones are the ones surrounding the Valentin Valley. And our institute, anyone can click on any of these traces and then pull out a great deal of information on each vault, if there is research on them. So you can click on this icon and then you will see the full information. Some of these faults were used for the civil protection plan in Murcia, Seismur 2, incorporating possible scenarios for possible earthquakes in the Murcia region, especially those on the south and north of Lorca. And then one of the faults, well, a fault is basically a big fracture of affecting the earth crust. So the top of the fault would be this, and here we'd have this landscape. We would have a mountain range, a valley, and the top part of the fault is at low temperature and is always blocked, but the deep part is always sliding around. And if we have a very clear map of an active fault with a deep part always sliding, constantly sliding, slowly but surely, and then the top part is blocked, then this is accumulated tension and friction. This could be blocked for 3,000 years. At some point, it won't be able to deal anymore with the tension, then it will move 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, and that's the earthquake. So in the case of Lorca, there was a small rupture, small break, moving just about 10 centimeters, and we're talking about 1.2, 1.5 of magnitude. If instead of 10 centimeters, we were talking about a meter, we'd have a big earthquake, 6 points in the Richter scale. So this would be a seismic cyclone.
Yes, if I may, we can only see the first page of your slideshow, and you're going through the different slides, but we cannot follow Let me try again. Yes, I apologize, but here we see the slideshow. The first page on the slideshow, prevention and control of seismic activity. The case of the Alama fault as origin of the Lorca earthquake. Okay, I see it's frozen. Let me try this again.
No sé si ahora se aprecia cómo pasan las
Ahora,
Can you
diapositivas.
now see my slideshow? Yes, we can now see your PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much, Professor. Well, let me continue. As I was saying, that I'm going to begin by going over why earthquakes take place in Murcia and in other area, and go into the Lorca quake. And I was saying that seismic activity is associated, you see the edges of tectonic plates. As you know, under the crust there are these plates that are displaced. In Spain, there's somewhere in the middle of the Eurasian and African plates. This creates stress that gives way to faults. The latter, many are well known. This is the global active fault database, and you see a great many in Eastern Mediterranean and many in the Iberian Peninsula and in the Betic mountain range, where the Murcia region is located. This is an open blog, blogs.openquake.org, to manage quake risk. This is a Spanish database of the quaternary faults. This has been produced by the relevant authorities. You see the different faults here, and as I was mentioning, this would be the Alama de Murcia fault. You can clearly see the Guadalentin Valley is located, but you have Palomares fault, Carrascares fault. It's close to Nurcia, the Crevillente fault, but the most active and well studied would be the Guadalentin Valley faults, which are the ones at hand. You can access this database, click on the link, and gain insight onto charts and scientific information on activity, publications. I'll not go into that. I was saying that these faults that you can see here on the screen have been updated in the special civil protection plan when faced with a seismic risk in the region of Murcia. This is called Sismi More, and this would be the fault cycle, because it is here where danger lies. This affects the whole crust above. These are locked. You see valleys, and below you see that there's ongoing sliding movement. This is a simplified model of a fault. The lower part is sliding. On top you see that it's locked. It's the seismic phase. It could be there for years, but the deeper end is on moving permanently with time. The accumulated stress gives way to a rupture, a co-seismic phase that we call. That's the earthquake right there. And if there's a little, this is a small rupture, but if this that gives way to a small earthquake. But if it's, you see that the whole fault is broken, then the magnitude is 6 or above. So since the deeper part of the fault, once the earthquake happened, keeps moving because this never stops, the top part starts to accumulate stress again, and so some 100 years can elapse. The 100 years before the second quake happens, but there is a cycle here. So you have stress that builds up and then it's released, up and down, released, accumulate and release. Sometimes you have 5, 5.2, 4.2 mag, and this is a cycle. What you need to understand in order to correctly calculate the danger of faults is you need to learn the cycle, the size of these faults per annum, and the magnitude that can happen. What happens if the whole fault breaks? Well, this is what you see in California, New Zealand. So the land surface is broken, and if there's something built on top, well, damage ensues. Fortunately, most earthquakes are small and do not break the surface in the southeast in Alhama de Murcia, the one that gave way to the Lurca earthquake. Many quakes have taken place throughout history, not only in 2011. We recently learned that the 1674 earthquake that produced dead and many casualties happened right here in this area, 10-15 kilometers. The 2011 earthquake with magnitude 5 was the consequence of a rupture of a small fraction 3 kilometers near Lorca. There have been other quakes like that in 1818 that were more serious than others in other regions, but we're short on time, so we can't go into that now. Therefore, we are talking about a dangerous fault, and thus our research. As for the Lorca earthquake, the Alhama de Murcia fault in this area, well, this is a view from the Peña Rubia outlook post, looking at the Sierra de la Tercia. The epicenter was here, like in this loop that the freeway describes, and this was the epicenter near Lorca, and was very superficial. This is an animated clip. I don't know whether you can see this well, but this would be the fault, which is a plane tilted northward, and a small stretch of 3 times 3 kilometer is reactive. And well, we know the effects that ensued. Again, this is just a small 3-kilometer stretch. It was a moderate earthquake, so to speak, hence the surface was not broken. So we only felt the vibration. Had the surface been broken, it would have been worse, so we just felt the vibration. Why did it cause such devastation, given it was small from a geologic standpoint? Well, the rupture point would be this square, this rectangle here. So say this is the fault, in blue. The plane is tilted northeast. The rupture area is 3 times 3 kilometers. It's just outside the city, but the propagation, the spread of this rupture, because a quake is a rupture. It's like the windshield of a car crashing by a rock. Well, this is more or less the same wave. These waves went towards Lorca, and the latter were more serious than normal. So severe damage was caused to the city, much more so than the impact underwent by buildings that were nearer to the epicenter. Hence, it's important to research faults, not only its history, but its nature, how faults behave in the face of earthquake, because this impacts danger, because here a small earthquake from a geological standpoint had a huge impact in Mula, and other areas of Murcia, which were closer, suffered a few damage because of the geographic location, but also because of those Doppler wave lag effect, and the propagation, the scattering direction was different. So this has been shown in green. You see rocks that fell down, and landslides. So this had a huge effect. Communication lines were blocked in those areas. And something that's also interesting, and it's why we need to study and actually studying the Alhama Murcia fault, is that this borders the Guadalentin Valley, and these populations here were settled in high areas, in ridges, and close to fertile lowlands for to grow crops. And here you see Lorca, Totana, and Alhama, 3 important towns along the border. If you have traced right below Puerto Luneras, we need to study where these go through, because we've performed geophysical study. These are only interpretations of the fault. The same goes for Totana and Alhama. And if you remember the surface rupture, then we will understand how important it is to study these faults and to understand how often do these quakes happen. I'm not here to frighten anyone, but intervals are longer than other faults, including California and New Zealand. Here we're talking about millions and thousands of years, but we still need to research. In fact, the geological register, if you perform trenches, we've seen quakes magnitude above 6 with rupture of surface between Lorca and La Olla, between Puerto Lumbreras. So we performed a prehistoric timeline to see how the fault has behaved. This, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to convey. The idea being to understand quakes from a geologic standpoint, why the Lorca earthquake happened and why did so much damage. How can we prevent this? Well, we cannot anticipate this as today. That's not feasible, but we can foresee the maximum mag that can be expected over the next year. So to perform danger risk. We have a new map, which you can see on the lower left-hand side of the slide. The highest risk has increased when including faults in the calculations. Well, of course, danger goes up, so acceleration in the Lorca earthquake was considered the most probable 0.16, and the earthquake was way beyond that. It reached 0.39 Gs in acceleration, hence the damage. With new maps, we see this acceleration right here. These maps are then used to design seismic resistant building norms. So these are the maps, and you need to look at the different municipalities because it's important. We need to monitor faults to oversee their activity very quickly. Danger maps, I won't go into this. For Seismimur, we undertook in the RIS project, we performed a danger threat map for the Murcia region, where you have estimates of probabilities of large movements in the area in the following 500 years. You see where risk is higher, not that you can draw conclusions. It's not only the kind of the fault, but also the land, which is soft. These maps are highly complex because they take into account the nature of the substrate of the earth on which locations, towns and cities are settled. It's important to perform this and to be able to zoom in from a municipal standpoint. It's important to perform risk analysis broken down by municipalities because they have different characteristics, so where they're located, the type of fault, the type of land. This has been done in Lorca and is being done in Murcia, this risk study, but it should be performed across all towns and cities in the region where acceleration is, as per the map, important, which are the most municipalities in the region, by the way, and this also goes for the rest of Spain. What are we doing to better understand how faults behave? Well, we perform a monitoring activity, so this is good for planning, but there needs to be due from a regional standpoint to see how cities should grow and where the city should grow. So we're monitoring this. This project is called Active Step, undertaken by the Spanish Ministry. It's been done by the Complutense Polytechnic Universities and the Geologic Institute of Spain. Let me give you a snapshot so that you can see what we're doing and what we're doing, in which we've performed a single survey in this fault going through the Alhama fault in La Torrecilla in southeast Lorca next to the Rafael Mendez Hospital, which and this it allows us to understand more the rock below the fault. So this here you see the crust rock in the fault. So this would be the Lorca Castle mountain range. The results have proven highly interesting. We performed a survey with the Spanish Geographic Institute, and we have set up a seismic station deep in the earth. So we're monitoring microseismicity. This will prove useful when we have significant quake to see how the waves spread. Then we have the geodesic monitoring, which is to quantify the slow deformation, because faults are blocked, but via GPS we can see stress below, because the lower part is permanently moving. So we have GPS stations that have been located throughout the valley. We have more and more of these. Some measure on a yearly basis, other are permanently connected, and you can read what is recorded real time. We have some 20 of these stations. We have 20 permanent stations too. We want to set up a new one in Las Estancias mountain range, and another one in the Lorca basin. So the idea is to obtain enough funds to have the densest geodesic surveillance system set up in Spain, and one of the densest in the Mediterranean, to see how the fault behaves. This is already proving useful to understand stress and strain. This is the geochemical monitoring of the Alhama fault. So it studies waterways. We inject sensors via some pipes along these waterways. We use radon. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this gas. It is emitted when there's a quake. So surveying radon is important because this is at the avant-garde of knowledge, but we're using this to see what is happening right here. We're in collaboration with the Madrid Fire Squad. We're monitoring in Alhama de Murcia the chasm in the fault, and you can, it reads temperature and radon. All of this is monitored. So if there's an earthquake, you can see the variations, and use this in future quakes to predict, or as an alert. So this is the avant-garde of knowledge, and this requires time and data, because it's a slow fault which produces deformation in the long term, and data necessary. That's what the current state is. So this is how we're monitoring the whole fault. By way of conclusion, let me simply point out what I mentioned earlier. Quakes are produced by faults, and you need to research this, produce maps, and use this information to plan urban development. So that if you're going to build, you need to see whether there is a risk of an earthquake. So you need to have safety borders, safety areas. There are no there's no significant damage should a quake occur. The Lorca earthquake is a clear example that faults need research to assess danger. This is true for serious and moderate earthquakes. As for methods for prevention, we need to look at what is happening. We need to monitor. We need to study. We need to have real-time information, and this is how you can really make the most. And in line with this, you need to look at what's happening ongoingly. Monitoring is key to learn medium and long-term findings. Haven't gotten into certain technicalities, but perhaps one way of diminishing risk in the future has to do with education, raising awareness, so that the citizenship knows about the risk of earthquakes, and they should know how to act in case of an emergency. And they need to know processes. If the population is aware of the process. They know what will happen, will be less scared. In Lorca, there were casualties because some people didn't know how to act and faced with an earthquake. Some people left the buildings and rubble fell on them. So this is something that we need to take into account in Lorca. This is a lesson drawn. Okay, that was my presentation. And thank you again for allowing me to participate in this event today.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The interpreter speaking, I'm afraid the chairman, the president of the Murcian Regional Assembly's microphone is muted. Now the sound is back on. Okay, thank you for this information. This fault is what triggered the disaster in Lorca in 2011. Let's move on to the last presentation today. We have Mr. Fulgencio Aviles, who got his architecture degree in '79 in the Architecture School in Madrid since March 2014. He's a PhD at the Madrid Polytechnic University. In the year 2007, he was awarded the Regional Architecture Award for the renovation and adaptation of the Antigones headquarters. He's a Spanish representative in the Executive Committee of European Architects and president of ASEMAS, the Architecture and Mutuality Insurer. He was there and when the Lorca earthquake hit, and he's going to tell us what they did because he was there firsthand and how technicians were organized in this city that had been devastated, how many buildings were at risk of being torn down or collapsing, and you've seen what a disaster ensued, and Mr. Aviles Inglés was a witness and as an architect can tell us what happened on that tragic night of 11 May 2011. Mr. Fulgencio Aviles Inglés, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in this meeting. Well, good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon to one and all. I'd like to thank the regional parliament for allowing me to discuss the most relevant professional experience that I've had in my life, and it allowed me to grow as a technician. If I may, I'd like to begin with my PowerPoint presentation. There's something wrong with the clicker. It's now working. Okay, my apologies. Let me go back. As our geology professor has mentioned, there was an earthquake in Lorca, damage and casualties were distributed in this axis, north, east, west, coinciding with the fault. The damage was terrible. There were dramatic scenes. Police and other local bodies had to come in because everything was blocked. I received a call from Lorca, and he said, "Don't even try to get there because you can access." I was very obedient, and at 7 in the morning, I left Cartagena, headed to Lorca. Our geologist has explained why the earthquake was so devastating, despite the magnitude being lower than that in Japan, but it had a huge impact on buildings. There were horrible scenes. There were heroes left and right, and everybody left their homes and had to sleep outdoors. This is the following morning. One freeway lane was opened up, and I was guided by a colleague, and that's him right there on the chopper. And I drove in my car right behind him to see what had happened in the area. The Architects Association aid was requested by the authorities. This was the following morning. People were out there looking for technicians for their buildings to be assessed. Many people had packed their bags and were ready to leave. By and large, and maybe too daring, but this was the situation of the Lorcan population, like little puppies. Everything was hanging by a thread, and the region approved a plan called Sismimul for immediate action, whereby volunteers, as you can see on the lower left-hand side, were part of, on the one hand, an intervention group and a seismic assessment group. Over 200 volunteers gathered there. Some of us were architects, others were other building technicians, and we were under the orders of the civil protection body. Smaller groups were made to identify urgent problems. In parallel, the regional ministry set out an emergency plan, and a technical manager for each monument was assigned. So each monument in Lorca was assigned to a technician that established the measures that had to be taken. We did not focus on heritage, but rather homes. This is the area, and there were different teams and groups, and we studied, surveyed the area and buildings. There was a template that had to be filled out as per the Sismi-Moore plan. This proved difficult to fill out, not to mention to interpret. And in light of the situation, a group of volunteers that were called to a side decided, having seen the status of things, on the right you see Carmen Salmeron, who was Director General for Transportation. She coordinated volunteers, and we suggested the following: to have the simplified file with the three kinds of damages to buildings, so volunteers in a very straightforward way could simply pick the kind of damage with a color code. This is what we did. Thanks to this simple, straightforward form, were we able to obtain clear information and fast. Since there were different technicians with different background and training, some buildings, you would see a green dot, which meant, okay, somebody else would come along and would erase the former dot and would draw a yellow dot, meaning that you had to investigate and do something, and then somebody else would come along and to replace this with a red spot, which means you cannot go in. This gave way to what was called a cross-sectional zero action. I had the honor to be part of this with Juan Roldan, who is the architecture professor of structures and professor at UCAM. And when faced with doubt, the police or fire brigade would call us, and we would look into it. And we saw sites like these, everything was dangerous. People did things to the best of their knowledge. But this form proved very useful. We had to enter buildings that one would think had been devastated by a bomb. We saw pillars that were completely severed. Became almost business as usual. Thanks to these forums, we put together a map and we assessed buildings. During the first 25 hours, 552 buildings were examined. At 72 hours, we have looked into 7,000 cases, and you have the color code below 10% red, 30% yellow, green 61%. Ultimately, after 3 weeks of work, this was the final count. So 11% was serious damage, 16% yellow, and the rest didn't require special action. The professional associations put together instructions as to what technicians should do to avoid problems and deliver society with a better service. We saw situations like this. I had the chance to personally visit this on the 12th. There was no concrete below. It was just standing on 8 little pillars. It was fenced off. Neighbors couldn't access the building. The owners, it was tilted towards, it was almost hanging. So this is the identification form that Ronda and myself did. The city hall said it had to be demolished. Neighbors wanted to use this crane, and I said, no, this is crazy. As soon as I pronounced the word crazy, by the time I said Z in crazy, this is what happened. The building collapsed on top of a church, and that church was also destroyed. These are the pictures that I took myself. The problem is that when a building collapses like this, it would affect neighboring buildings. So the first big building was this one, and when doing so, caused huge damage on the neighboring buildings. So us, the group 0, had to go there and take measures to really brace the buildings, to support the buildings. In some cases, the pillars were totally severed. The conditions weren't easy, but not a single accident happened. No, not one voluntary suffered any kind of injury in undertaking our task. So this is a volunteer. She's protected with a helmet, and that building was torn down because it was really damaged. We would go there with the local police and fire brigade, but there reached a point in time when police had to do other more important things. As I remember, a kitchen, everything was destroyed, and I took a spoon, a screwdriver, and I bought a flashlight. With these 3 little tools, I produced my report. Sometimes we had to get some rest, as you can easily surmise. This is the fire brigade right there. What they did was short of unbelievable. They had participated in the Haiti earthquake recovery. We had Bomberos en Acción and other NGOs. All of this was coordinated by this gentleman in red, who was the head of engineers in Madrid. We had people coming from Cartagena, Murcia, Madrid, and their efforts were simply unbelievable. The military unit their performance was a bit shaky at first because they had no previous experience, as was recognized by the Lieutenant General. We helped them out, and their activity then proved useful. So this was us trying to not only give instructions, but convince neighbors. These gentlemen here are the owners of that building I mentioned earlier, who wanted to enter. They were there standing guard to prevent looters or people from stealing, but they wanted to know what would happen to their building. We decided that it had to be torn down because it was dangerous. That's the moment when we explained what the status of their building was, because we thought it was important to add peace of mind. Different communities reacted differently. Sub-Saharan people, when we entered their homes and we told them that they could no longer be there, they would just pick up their belongings in no time and just left. Ukrainians, for example, would tell us what we had to do. They believed they were more experts. The Muslim community was frightened, and the Latin American community felt so close to their property that we even had to force people out of their buildings. Look at this case. So one of the buildings was almost on the ground, and we almost had to pull them by force out of there. And then we had experts come in, other architects to train volunteers quickly to explain causes and what to do. And we felt highly supported by our professional associations. Not all buildings sustained damage, and some recently finished buildings were in perfect order. Some said that the seismic regulations were inadequate, but those buildings that had been built following the seismic regulations were able to stand undamaged. Damage was sustained mainly by buildings where some mistakes have been made. There are these so-called dwarf pillars that had been used to provide garages with ventilation. They were very short, they were highly rigid, and the stress and strain caused damage and led to many buildings collapsing. But these buildings that, like the ones on the right-hand side, had been well calculated and following the seismic rules, sustained no damage whatsoever.
Okay, truth be told, civil protection was surprised, but this is the first time they launched the Cinemur plan. I must admit they did it well. And well, we are really good at playing by ear in Spain. And that's what we did, because in Italy, in L'Aquila earthquake, there were 6 injuries between the specialists, and here there were no injuries. But then civil protection and the autonomous region took on 4 courses for voluntary technicians. So there are already 200 professionals in the Murcia regions who are prepared to tackle these catastrophes, these disasters, according to the protocols. And then there was a dry run in Cartagena, Lorca, and Murcia, neighboring areas, in a drill. And it was an interesting experience. So we are very well prepared for possible earthquakes. Then there were subsidiary norms at regional and local norms, so that buildings now incorporate some additional factors. The 9 casualties we had at Lorca happened outside of buildings because of the fall of what we call the appendixes, the falling of chimneys and hanging elements in buildings. And this is what we call appendixes, which should have now a more solid anchor and fixing more solidly to buildings. So I have to say the effort was huge. And Lorca now is a new city, very well rebuilt, and the buildings have been renovated also very well. And I like to add that we have legislation on volunteer work at national and regional level. So this law establishes that the public administration should provide, or rather first defines volunteer work, the scope, and then sets forth the rights of volunteer works who are entitled to be covered under the volunteer work entity for any work-related illnesses, conditions, or responsibilities arising out of a third-party damage. So this has been passed in different autonomous regions in Spain, and here we have the legal framework of all the laws that were approved in different autonomous regions, and this might change slightly, but the Murcia region and government need to be aware that we need to use this protection system for volunteer workers. In our organization and our mutual insurance companies, we warned our colleagues of the precautions to be taken, and then we told them that they could rest assured that our civil insurance would cover any possible contingency. So they shouldn't, well, they could have peace of mind when working. And thus I conclude my intervention, stressing how thankful I am to pay homage to what happened there and to reviving that era, and how we got back from that situation with 9 casualties. Luckily, we could have had more, given the falling materials from buildings. So back in the day, the population was totally disoriented. They needed support and guidance. And I like to stress that politicians across the parties agreed. And the mayor, the council members were there on the streets with the neighbors. So that was a huge, unbelievable experience that we like to share with you so we can all learn from it. Thank you, Mr. Avilés. No doubt, those who lived firsthand those tragic moments will not forget them. And now that you've mentioned the mayor of Lorca, Don Francisco Jodar, I'd like to send a warm homage, a warm memory, send my warmest regards to our former mayor. And Avilés has left some ideas, some food for thought. For example, the anthropological research that could have been done of the situation. And Mr. Avilés, there are 2 cases I remember perfectly. Obviously, I lived that as a journalist, as a reporter. I spent 6 days there after the first quake and the second quake, the 10-7 one. And then I saw a lady living, an 80-year-old lady, leaving her home. She refused to do so, and the only thing she took with her was the picture of her wedding. And then, on that street you were talking about, when there was this volunteer worker with a bib, I saw a young guy risking his life from the drummers band, that he risked his life to get his trumpet back. So he he neglected all instructions from the UME, but because he wanted to get back his trumpet, and then we could have an anthropological study on the behavior of locals during the day. Yes, well, we were two architects and two firefighters, and we had to run away because we saw dust gathering and pieces falling because we thought that would fall down on us. Also, regarding the external elements, this boy, actually, he was a boy, the boy from the vineyard. He was actually killed by the cornice, by the ledge. The family could leave the house, but it was the ledge that fell onto him. And then also a roof collapsed and killed 3 people. And a technical question, as an architect, we've seen not so much the house, but the vineyard house, which collapses after the earthquake. How does that building collapse? And how come the others stay put? Well, that was part of 3 structures, and it had small pillars which absorb more momentum and more effort in their movement. Since they are shorter, they are more rigid, and they absorb all this strength. So there were 2 facades with short pillars. And at the same time, it was the applause effect. He was hit by the others and then pushed it. Well, as you can see, we could be talking with Mr. Avilés about 1,000 things, but now it's time for conclusions. But before we conclude this intense conference starting at 9:30 this morning, I'd like to thank all the contributions from different participants in this webinar, which has helped us revive how we lived such a natural disaster as that of Lorca through the eyes and experiences of specialists such architect Avilés or professionals from the media, directors La Verdad, Cadena Ser, or Siete Televisión, our regional TV. Also, with José Jesús Martínez, DG for research of geodynamic planetary dynamic, we've learned now about the behavior of the Alhama fault. And from the mayor of Lorca, we've learned of the reconstruction process after the earthquake that is now turned into a land of opportunities, thanks to the effort of everyone, the separation spirit, the solidarity and cooperation have enabled all the activity deployed by local, regional, national, and European institutions that 9 years afterwards have made it possible that the World Heritage of this Ciudad del Sol gets back on its foot and shines again, and is one of the cities in Spain with the best preserved world heritage. By listening to each contribution, I've drawn several conclusions that I like to share with you all. I'll start with the importance of the specialists, the need of supporting political action with the rigor and knowledge provided by specialists. When preventing national disasters, with infrastructures, with building regulations, as when we need to cure, when we need to deal with the effects of a disaster, as the 26 teams of architects did, and also volunteer workers who were also working on the ground for 48 hours. And they were checking all the buildings without any casualties, providing their citizens with peace of mind amidst the chaos. The second conclusion is the huge importance of institutional collaboration, which unfortunately we are missing during the COVID pandemic. LOCA should be a leading example for reconstruction, leaving aside political struggles, political interests, and it brought together institutions from the regional, national, and European level. The third conclusion is that, as we've witnessed with the reconstruction of LOCA, politics, in its most noble meaning, is positive for the citizens. It's the moment, especially given the pandemic, to leave aside the politics of confrontation and talking about politics in capital letters, consensus, agreements for the benefit of our citizens. Regarding the role of regional parliaments in the face of natural disasters, the lecture of Mr. Fernández de Simón, chair of the Parliamentary Lawyer Associations and also chair of this assembly, has highlighted that regional parliaments have the powers to pass regulations for the benefit of those affected by natural disasters. As we've seen after the Lorca's earthquake, also we can control somehow the use of European aid by promoting specific interventions, and also as administrations which are close to the citizens, we should intervene in the need for preventive politics, or preventive policies. For example, drafting regional regulatory framework for such events. But I'd like to take things a step further. We are hosted by the Calre with 74 regional assemblies in Europe. This is a forum for exchange of ideas and experiences, and through the parliamentary lawyer, we've learned that coordination was essential for the recovery, but we need to get rid of red tape obstacles, and it's also important to improve the regulations so that regardless of which level we are acting in, aid comes in a timely manner so that people can go back to normal and overcome as fast as possible the disgrace of such an event. The voice of a single regional parliament would be lost. The voice of 74 European Regional Assembly can't be ignored. It will never be lost. It will be a choral sound. And that's why I'm thoroughly convinced of the importance of strengthening Europe and streamlining their response. And that's the way to do it, all together, all united. All in all, thank you very much for your kind attention. It's been a huge honor to share this conference with you all, made possible by a group of professionals who've been there working behind the scenes, behind the spotlight, but they made this webinar possible. I am deeply thankful. And also, I'd like to urge you to our next meeting, which I hope it will be on-site, so that we can keep on working on natural disasters. And now, if you will allow me, we go for the closing ceremony. I have the huge honor to introduce the president, the chair of Calre, and also President of the Canarian Parliament, Gustavo Matos, for the closing ceremony of this international conference that we've held, focusing on earthquakes, natural disasters, and floods, also focusing on the Murcia region. Dear Mr. Matos, you have the floor. Thank you, dear President. I'll start by congratulating you and all your team, working side by side with you to make this meeting possible. These are difficult times, but thanks to technology, we can keep our activity. We can keep the agenda that was our objective for this year, for this Calre conference, and also for the working groups making up all this activity. So, dear President, congratulations on my behalf and on the behalf of all the chairs and presidents of the assemblies. Again, thank you and congratulations to you and all workers, to all your team, making this conference possible. Also, I'd like to thank the other members from different parliaments joining us today, working today, and also sharing a message of normality despite the pandemic. I'd like to conclude very briefly with some reflections. I think the contributions today have been of a very high standard, and there is little that I could add, but some reflections I'd like to add. One that was underlined and shared by everyone. When natural disaster strikes anywhere in Europe, this is a European disaster for all the European states making up Europe, and the European project is not just a natural disaster in a specific place far away from us. It's a disaster on our own territory. That's how we should understand it. So when we make this idea our own, we'll be more able to permeate all the community-based policies with this idea, with prevention first, and then reconstruction, mitigation second. As these damages can happen in any part of the European territory. You know that the Canary Islands, the territory that I chair, is an island-based, is an archipelago, also a volcano-rich area, affecting, obviously, the citizens who live with volcano activity on a daily basis, and this forces us to coexist with this possibility of eruptions or quakes, earthquakes, which are not of a tectonic plate bay origin, such as in the mainland, but in our cases, these are linked to the volcanic activity. But help us be aware that we are living in a living planet, and we need to be able to coexist with this risk. And that's one of the reflections we like to share with you. And also, I like to stress another idea that somehow has been shared during this session, and that part of the natural disasters are anthropogenic, human-related. Well, some were related to former activities such as fracking, but these many activities are human-related with perverse effects on, well, we are very well aware of our actions, our repercussions on climate change. And this also applies to natural disasters. And we're talking about atmospherical phenomena or other more violent events such as wildfires. And well, we shouldn't neglect that the fight against climate change and the SDGs probably now have been sidelined on the media, and as we are focusing all our efforts on the COVID pandemic, but we shouldn't forget that the planet is still alive, and we are still suffering firsthand the effects of climate change. And this is closely linked with some of the natural disasters that we are facing, and especially with the intensity, with the severity. We can see more and more intense wildfires, not just during the summer season, but also during other seasons, and they're always very aggressive, which makes it very difficult to put them out by the firefighting teams and other related teams. So to conclude, these two ideas should always be on the table when we are tackling the natural disaster phenomenon. We should think that if they happen on the European territory, they affect everyone, and think also of the human-related actions on climate change. And then also deepen our coordination policies by sharing our experiences when preventing or tackling with the aftermath of such events. And also one of the guiding principles of the European project is solidarity. So when this happens, we should all contribute to help our European colleagues so that everyone can overcome the effects of such events. So again, thank you. Congratulations, dear President. Congratulations to your team. Thanks to whoever who has participated today, and different representatives from the different European regional assemblies. And then that's all from me. If you will, I declare this conference closed with the hope that we can meet again on site. Human interaction can be substituted, it's irreplaceable, and the exchange of ideas, opinions, not just during the formal session, but then before, during, and after the session is very important. And well, with this note, I hope that we can go back to the on-site events, and I send you my warmest regards. And also, I'd like to close this very fruitful working group conference. Well, my warmest regards, a hug, dear colleague, President of the Canarian Assembly, and then we close this conference. And I hope that very soon we will be able to hug each other again on site. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being there and for following this conference. Thank you.